The house exhaled as though it lived, a low and dreadful sound that shivered through the timbers and seemed to reach beneath the skin of anyone who lingered too long in its halls. It was no ordinary creak of wood, no harmless groan of foundation settling in the earth. It was the sound of something that waited, something that listened, something that remembered every scream that had ever bled into its boards. They said the mansion on the plantation had been raised from swamp earth and grave clay, each beam nailed into place with curses whispered by men who were not allowed to speak freely in daylight. The walls had been painted white once, but the damp of Louisiana nights had stained them to the color of old bone, streaked with veins of mildew that looked like hands reaching out from beneath a shroud. And when the wind stilled, when no crickets sang and no frogs called from the bayou, the house itself breathed, slow, deep and heavy, as if the walls had lungs and the ceilings had throats. The slaves who served within its rooms swore they heard it inhale their secrets. "Don't whisper here," one warned another in the candle-lit kitchen, "for the walls have tongues, and what you give them, they keep." Sometimes when a servant fell asleep by the hearth, they would wake choking, as if invisible hands had pressed their mouths shut, forcing their dreams into the cracks of the floorboards, where the mansion fed on them like meat. The masters never spoke of this, or perhaps they could not hear it, for to them the house was not alive. It was only theirs, a monument of their dominion carved into the land, but the ones who toiled in its shadow knew better. They saw the shutters open on nights when no hand touched them. They heard the staircases groan not from weight but from want, and they felt the hunger of the house most keenly when it grew still, as if holding its breath to better listen, at dusk. When the cypress trees threw long shadows across the veranda, the mansion loomed like a thing too heavy for the soil beneath it. Windows glared like wet eyes, dark and unblinking. The slaves would not linger in the hall after sundown, for they said the portraits on the walls shifted when no one looked directly at them, their painted lips curling into smiles not meant for the living. One evening, as rain smeared the windows and thunder prowled the skies, a house slave named Dinah swore she heard the mansion call her name. It was not in the voice of her master, nor of her kin, but in a hollow breath that rasped through the chimney flue. "Dinah," it moaned. Her hands froze upon the ladle she held. The stew boiled over, spitting against the hearth, but she dared not move. The fire flared, though no log had been added, casting the room in red so deep it looked as though she had been thrown into the mouth of hell. Others claimed they too had heard their names whispered, not shouted, never commanded, but beckoned softly, like a lover urging them closer. One boy said the house had sung to him in the night, humming through the beams above his pallet until he cried out in terror and was beaten for waking the others. Still, he insisted, the mansion sang, its song older than the cotton fields, older than the masters, older even than the soil where bones sank unmarked. There was a story no one told in full, but every servant knew the edges of it. They said a girl once tried to flee through the corridor at midnight. The doors opened for her, yes, wide as mercy, but when she stepped across the threshold, the air turned thick as tar. Her body was found at dawn in the parlor, her lips blue, her eyes wide, her face pressed against the boards as though the floor itself had swallowed her breath. And those who scrubbed the spot claimed the stain never faded, and not blood, not mold, something darker that spread if you stared too long at it. So they whispered, though not too loudly, that the house was not merely shelter, not merely wood and plaster, but a vessel, that it feasted on silence and secrets, that it grew fat on unspoken fear, that every cry choked back, every prayer mouthed but not voiced, every dream stifled before it could leave the lips. All of it was food for the mansion's rotting lungs. The night the poison would simmer, the night her vengeance would begin, the mansion exhaled more heavily than ever before. Shutters clapped against their frames without wind. Rafters groaned like old bones bending. The very walls swelled with the pressure of their own breathing. Dinah stood alone in the kitchen, her bare feet damp with spilled broth, her hands trembling not from fear of the masters, but from the mansion itself, for it was not merely watching her, it was waiting. And when the house drew in its next breath, the candles guttered, the walls trembled, and in the silence that followed she heard it whisper again. Closer now, deeper, hungrier. Dinah. The night smelled of iron and wet earth, as though the soil itself had been overturned to expose something meant to stay buried. Inside the kitchen, where shadows clung to every beam and the fire spat low embers. Her hands moved with the silence of someone who had decided long ago that fear would no longer command her. She crushed the leaves slowly, deliberately. Though they bit into her skin with a bitter oil that burned faintly at her fingertips, no one spoke their name aloud, for to name them was to call forth what they carried, a knowledge older than the land, older than the chains, older even than the language of the masters. The leaves whispered as they broke, a dry susurrus like teeth grinding in the dark. She ground them into powder against the worn stone. The pestle shook with her hand, yet she did not falter. "Bitter roots for bitter men," she murmured under her breath, the words soft as prayer and sharp as blade. The powder rose like dust from bones clinging to her wrists, tracing lines that seemed almost written into her flesh. The pot before her simmered, thick with meat and marrow. It bubbled as though alive, the fat rising like drowned faces gasping for breath. Steam unfurled into the rafters, carrying scents too heavy, too sharp, too wrong. She stirred once, twice, each motion slow, as if the stew itself resisted her will. A voice slipped from the dark corner of the room, or was it only the hiss of the fire? "Girl," it rasped, "you stir for death." She did not look up. "I stir for freedom," she whispered, "and let death be the seasoning." The kitchen walls leaned inward, or perhaps it only seemed so, their breaths, the mansion's breaths, pulled at her hair and tugged her garments like unseen hands. The house was listening. The house wanted to taste. She added the powder, letting it fall in a steady stream, pale and bitter against the bubbling darkness of the stew. The fire flared as though in recognition. The flames licked the sides of the pot with greedy tongues, casting shadows across the ceiling that twisted like hanged men swaying in silence. The bitterness clung, not only to her palms but to the very air. Servants passing in the corridor paused, their noses wrinkling, their eyes narrowing. "Something foul in there," one muttered. Another crossed himself. Though no priest had blessed him to do so, they hurried on, unwilling to linger where the air itself seemed poisoned. She bent closer to the pot, and for a moment the steam parted. She saw not stew but black water, and in that water a face stared back, hollow-eyed, jaw unhinged, lips torn as though gnawed away by unseen teeth. It mouthed words she could not hear. The vision vanished with the next roll of boiling broth. Her breath caught, but she did not stop stirring. The bitterness worked into her. It filled her mouth, though she had not tasted it. It slid down her throat, though she had not swallowed. And in the silence between the crackle of fire, she thought she heard a chorus, none, low voices, men, women, children, whispering from the depths of the pot. They did not curse her, they urged her on. More, they said. More. Her hand reached for another root. Its skin was rough, streaked with veins like human arms. She split it with the knife, and the juice that bled forth was not green nor white, but red, red like a wound that would never close. It dripped into the stew, hissing, disappearing, swallowed by the hunger of the boiling mass. Her heart beat with the rhythm of the ladle. The sound of stirring became the sound of drums, low, relentless, ancient. She remembered the songs sung in secret, the chants murmured when the overseer's back was turned, songs that did not beg for mercy, but promised reckoning. Her lips moved to them now. Though no sound escaped, the house heard anyway. It leaned closer. It listened, it shuddered. The bitterness grew unbearable. Her eyes watered, her chest burned, yet she kept stirring, for she knew that bitterness was not only the poison. It was the taste of justice itself. The pot hissed, spat, boiled higher. The shadows on the wall deepened into shapes that bent forward like hungry witnesses. One leaned so close it brushed against her ear, its breath cold, its voice a broken sigh. "They will drink, they will fall, and the house will feed." Her grip tightened on the ladle. She knew then that the poison was not hers alone. The roots carried the vengeance of more than one. It was the weight of all those silenced before her, pressed into leaves and soil. She stirred not only for her freedom, but for theirs. The stew roared as though it contained a storm. The pot trembled against the firestones, her vision blurred with smoke and steam. But in the haze she saw them, pale hands, dozens of them rising from the broth, fingers clawing upward, reaching for mouths that were no longer theirs. She staggered back, pressing her palm against her lips to hold in the scream. The hands sank again, the stew smoothing as though nothing had broken its surface. The room fell still, Only the bitter scent remained. Thick enough to choke, she knew then the stew was ready. And outside, in the dining hall, the table was being laid, the goblets polished, the chairs set for those who thought themselves eternal. The pot simmered, waiting. The mansion breathed heavy, and from the hall a bell rang, 1, 2, 3 times, calling them to feast. The feast began with laughter that did not belong to joy, but to power sharpened by cruelty. It rattled through the rafters like rusted chains, echoing off the walls that had listened too long to the hunger of men who mistook dominion for destiny. The candles burned lower than they should have, their wax sagging like flesh melted from bone. Each flame sputtered as though smothered by unseen lips. The shadows they cast did not fall away from the bodies at the table, but clung to them, draped across their shoulders like cloaks stitched from night. The masters feasted greedily, their knives scraping against porcelain, their teeth gnashing at meat still red at its heart. Every bite seemed too loud in the silence that followed, as if the room itself recoiled from the sound of their chewing, and then, without warning, the laughter stopped. A silence fell, not the silence of peace, but the silence that belongs only to graves. It was a silence thick enough to choke on, a silence that bent the air and made the walls listen closer. One of the women at the table shifted in her chair, her jewels clinking like shackles. Her eyes darted toward the shadows that now pooled at her feet. "Do you feel it?" she whispered, her voice barely rising above the throb of the flames. But no one answered. Their mouths were full, and the house was listening. The overseer coughed once, twice, his face reddened, but he swallowed hard and forced a grin. "Too much wine," he muttered. Though his eyes trembled toward the stew bowl, the others chuckled nervously, as if the sound might drive back whatever had settled over the room. But the chuckle died as quickly as it came. The silence pressed down heavier, thicker. The portraits on the walls leaned forward in the candlelight. Their painted eyes seemed wet, their lips twisted in new expressions unseen in daylight. One portrait's smile stretched wider than the frame allowed, the edges of its mouth spilling into the dark like ink, bleeding through paper. A servant passing the doorway glanced in and froze. He swore he saw every painted head turned toward the table. Waiting, watching, hungry, the master at the head of the table raised his goblet. The liquid within shimmered darker than wine, heavier than blood. He opened his mouth to speak a blessing, not to God, but to himself, as he always did. But no words came, only a rattle, low and thin, as if the air in his lungs had turned to dust. The others leaned closer, their forks stilled in the air. The candle flames shrank, their light dimming to pinpricks swallowed by the shadows. The silence broke at last, but not with words. With the scrape of chairs as every face at the table turned at once. Not toward him, but toward the kitchen door. Their eyes gleamed like glass marbles, wide and glistening. Their teeth shone too bright in the low light, and for a moment it seemed they were no longer eating food. But each other, the woman in pearls, trembled. "I hear," she began, her lips pale, but her voice cut off as if snatched mid-sentence. Her hand clawed at her throat, her nails raking lines down her skin. The silence shattered with the sound of choking. A wet gurgle spilled into the air, echoing too loud, too long. It was not one voice now, but many. Coughs, gasps, rattles, the choir of death rehearsing its hymn. The stew sat in its silver bowl steaming. The scent had changed. No longer savory, no longer of herbs and spice, but of earth freshly dug, of roots split open, of graves overturned. Each spoonful became a mouthful of soil, each swallow a shovelful heaped upon their own coffins. Their faces twisted, not only from poison but from something deeper. The candlelight revealed their skin cracking like porcelain left too long in fire. Their eyes bulged, as if something inside was clawing to escape. Teeth ground down, then lengthened, sharpened, and when their mouths opened to scream, no sound came. Only shadows spilled out, thick and writhing, slipping down their chins, dripping onto the plates, slithering across the tablecloth. The house inhaled, slow and deep. The curtains fluttered, though the windows were shut. The walls swelled outward, straining with the breath it drew. The shadows on the table crawled into the floorboards, feeding the mansion's endless hunger. At the far end of the table, one child sat silent. He had not eaten, his spoon untouched, but when he raised his head, his eyes were black pools, his mouth already full of earth. He smiled, wide and unbroken, and with that smile, every candle went out at once. The hall fell into darkness. Only the sound of gnashing teeth remained. And from the kitchen door where she stood listening, ladle still wet in her hand, Dinah saw the last flicker of flame die in a goblet of wine. The liquid hissed as though alive, and something pale, hand-like, pressed against the inside of the cup, as if trying to crawl free. It began with the sound of breaking glass, sharp, sudden, unnatural, as if the house itself had cracked a tooth. The goblet fell from the overseer's hand, shattering against the floor, its red wine spreading like a wound that bled wider and wider across the boards. He lurched forward in his chair, his laughter cut short, his lips trembling around a half-formed jest that never came. The sound that escaped him was not human, not cough, not breath, but a rattle like stones tumbling into a grave. The others stared, forks suspended in the air, eyes reflecting the candlelight as though already glassed by death. A laugh burst from another throat, too loud, too jagged, but it twisted mid-breath, turning into a scream that was swallowed before it could rise. The woman clawed at her neck, her pearls snapping, beads scattering across the table like teeth spilled from a broken jaw. The scream hung in the rafters, strangled, unfinished, and in the silence that followed, the air quivered as though the mansion itself had taken notice. The first shudder rippled through the dining hall. It was not the trembling of floorboards beneath weight. It was deeper, older, like the earth itself shifting beneath a buried coffin. Dishes rattled, knives scraped against porcelain, wine sloshed in untouched cups. The chandeliers swayed though no wind stirred, their crystals chiming in discordant tones like funeral bells ringing underwater. Some swore they saw it then. Something darker than death itself crouched behind their chairs. A shape too vast to be human, too thin to be beast, it bent low, its shadow stretching across the table, its head tilting, listening to the last gasps that spilled from poisoned throats. Its fingers, long as branches, traced the backs of their chairs without touching. And yet each master jerked as if struck, spines stiffening, eyes bulging, mouths opening to confess sins that no priest would ever hear. "Who's there?" one rasped, voice cracked with terror. The shadows did not answer, only the fire guttered lower, and the house exhaled, slow, deliberate, rattling through the beams like a sigh of satisfaction. A servant at the door dropped his tray, the silver clattering across the floor. His knees buckled, his hands shaking as he pressed them to his ears. "I hear it," he whispered. "I hear it breathing," but no one moved to quiet him. For they too heard it. The inhalation, the slow drawing in of every cough, every scream, every half-choked prayer. The mansion was feeding, and it did not wish to be disturbed. The overseer fell face first into his plate. The stew splashed upward, staining his cheeks with darkness. His hand twitched once, twice, then lay still. The woman beside him gripped his sleeve, her lips foaming, her eyes rolling white, her body convulsed, her chair tipping backward with a crack that echoed like bones breaking. The others rose, but too slowly. Their limbs seemed weighted. Dragged by unseen chains, one master tried to run. He pushed from the table, his boots striking the boards in frantic rhythm. But before he reached the door, the chandelier above shuddered violently. A crystal dropped, slicing across his cheek. He froze as if struck blind, and in that moment of stillness, the shadows swallowed him whole. He vanished from sight, leaving only the echo of his scream trapped in the walls. The child at the end of the table stared wide-eyed, his small hands folded neatly. He had not eaten, his lips unstained by poison, yet he smiled, slow and deliberate. His teeth gleamed too bright, too sharp, and in his blackened gaze, the others saw not salvation but reflection, themselves. Dying, writhing, already forgotten. The house shuddered again, louder, deeper. Plates rattled off the table, knives skittered across the floor. The windows pulsed in their frames, as though straining against the breath of some vast creature within. And then silence, heavy, suffocating, absolute. Every master sat slumped, twisted, or vanished, their faces frozen in grotesque contortions, their teeth bared in rictus grins. The only movement was the drip of wine mingled with blood, pooling beneath the table like a second feast prepared for the dead. In the corner, the shadows lingered. They did not recede, they coiled, thick and living, as though waiting for command. And when the last candle guttered, plunging the hall into blackness, something shifted in the silence. Not footsteps, not speech, but a low whisper carried on, breath not human. It was the sound of the house itself. And it said only one word, drawn long, guttural, unmistakable. More. Every swallow was a hymn, every cough a litany, every collapse an answered prayer. And in that moment, the air smelled of iron and judgment. The room trembled not from storm or quake, but from the trembling of bodies unmoored from life itself, as if some invisible hand had drawn tight the strings of their throats and plucked them, like an instrument of judgment. The great table of oak became an altar, its surface slick with spilled wine broth and the bile of the dying. Each master and mistress now part of a procession. No priest could sanctify. The poison moved with patience, a creeping gospel in their veins. First a shiver that bent spines into arcs of supplication, then a hacking that sent silver goblets rattling against their teeth. Then the silence, that dreadful silence, as one by one they fell still against the table, their heads bowed as though in prayer. Though no god they had ever called upon came to meet them, servants lingered in the corners, their eyes wide but their bodies frozen, bound by fear thicker than chains. They whispered between gasps as if afraid to call attention to themselves. "Is it sickness?" one murmured, voice like dry reeds in wind. "No." "It is judgment," another answered. His eyes locked on the woman who still stood by the hearth, spoon resting against the pot, her face half lit by the dimming firelight. She did not look triumphant. No smile, no gloating, only stillness, the kind of stillness that follows a funeral bell. Her hands folded as if in devotion. Her gaze lowered not to the writhing bodies, but to the coals that burned like dying stars. Her silence was its own prayer, heavier than the hymns the masters sang on Sundays. Hymns they forced others to sing with cracked lips and weary lungs. The sound of collapse grew rhythmic, one body after another slamming against wood, fabric tearing, jewelry clattering to the floor, each fall a toll of a bell no church dared ring. One man tried to rise, clutching at his neck as if to hold back his escaping breath, his voice a strangled plea, "Water, please water." But the only water in the room steamed in the pot, blackened with herbs bitter enough to stain the air itself, and the woman by the fire did not move, her stillness louder than his words. Another fell across his plate, teeth sinking into the roasted flesh before him, as though the dead were biting back. Wine pooled into the embroidered cloth, and ran to the edge of the table like dark rivers searching for a grave. The candles flickered lower, their wax dripping slow as blood. Shadows lengthened and climbed the walls, until it seemed the house itself bent forward to watch the death of its masters. Beams groaning as though eager to consume what the poison had begun. She did this," a mistress gasped, pointing a trembling finger toward the servant woman, her ring sliding loose as her hand shook, clattering against the wood as her body seized, her words dissolving into a gurgle. No answer came, no denial, no confession, only the hiss of the fire, the simmer of the pot, and the silence of a woman who understood that sometimes prayer requires no words, only sacrifice. The children of the house, pale-faced and wide-eyed, huddled at the far wall, clutching each other as the air thickened with iron and bile. One whispered, "Mama, why won't they stop?" But her mother lay already still, eyes open but unseeing, mouth slack as though trying to form a final hymn. The woman by the fire lifted her gaze at last, and for a moment her eyes caught the candlelight, not soft, not merciful, but unflinching, as if she had seen into the marrow of judgment itself. Her lips parted, and though her voice was soft, the words carried like a curse pressed into the bones of the house. "Every swallow was chosen, every feast was your prayer," she whispered, "and every prayer is now answered." A tremor ran through the room, as though the house had inhaled the words, drawing them into its black lungs. The very walls seemed to pulse with hunger, plaster cracking, beams moaning, the floorboards swelling beneath the weight of the dying. The children screamed, their cries echoing like birds trapped in a burning cage, then silence thick final, a silence that buried the room deeper than any grave could. Only the sound of the fire remained, licking slow and low at the black pot, as if waiting for her next prayer to be stirred, and in the doorway, unseen by most, a shadow shifted, taller than a man, its outline indistinct but its presence undeniable, as if summoned by the offering laid across the table. It waited, patient as midnight, watching the woman who had fed the house with her prayer of poison. Her eyes met it not in fear but in recognition, as though she had always known it would come. And when the last candle sputtered out, leaving the room in the breathless dark, it moved one step closer, and the house exhaled. Barefoot, she moved through the halls that whispered her name, Doors opened of their own accord, as if the house longed to see her gone. The silence in those corridors was not silence at all, but a choir of whispers pressed between the walls. Breathless murmurs of names never spoken in daylight. Names buried beneath cotton and cane. Names dragged through fields until they withered in the mouth. Now carried on the air like dust that would never settle. Her own name stretched and bent against the plaster, whispered low, rising higher, until it seemed the house itself called to her, with a voice made from 100 broken throats. The floorboards bent and released beneath her feet, warm as flesh, as though she walked not on wood but on the back of something breathing. The wallpaper peeled and curled inward, patterns of roses and vines warping into twisted shapes, each petal a mouth, each leaf a hand reaching. The gas lamps along the walls flickered, and then flared brighter as she passed. As though eager to see her face one last time, she did not look back, not at the dining hall she had left behind, not at the bodies slumped in prayerless repose, not at the children whose sobs had turned into silence. She knew to look back was to invite the house to take hold of her spine and twist her into its walls forever. Her breath came steady, though her heart pounded like iron against her ribs. She held no candle, yet the corridor lit itself, doors on either side creaking open without touch, some spilling only blackness, some spilling fragments of memory that clung like smoke. In one doorway she glimpsed a rocking chair, creaking though no one sat within, rocking faster and faster, until the sound was like teeth grinding bone. In another doorway, a crib stood beneath a veil of cobwebs, its sheets stained dark, the mobile above it turning slow, whispering in voices that did not belong to children. "Keep walking," she told herself, though the words carried no sound, only the rhythm of thought pounding in her skull. Behind her a door slammed shut of its own accord, the boom echoing like a hammer upon a coffin lid. The walls shuddered, as though pleased with themselves. Laughter seeped through the plaster, muffled, wet, hungry. At the far end of the hall she saw it, a door unlike the rest, not of polished oak or painted wood, but black, as though carved from midnight itself. Its frame pulsed faintly, breathing like an open wound. The air before it trembled with a heat that smelled of iron and salt. Her steps slowed, though she did not wish them to. Her body compelled as though strings had been fastened to her ankles, drawing her toward the black door. From behind one door to her left came a low voice, not loud, not urgent, but clear enough to chill the marrow. "Do not open it." She froze, her hand an inch from the handle, her eyes flicking toward the half-open doorway, the darkness inside too thick to pierce. But the voice came again, quieter, trembling. "Do not let it see you," the corridor sighed. And in that sigh she thought she heard the rustle of 1,000 skirts, the dragging of chains across stone, the scraping of nails down wood, each sound twining into the other until it became one sound and breathing. The handle before her gleamed, slick as though wet. She knew without touching it that it would burn her, mark her, claim her, and yet her fingers twitched, her body leaning toward it with the hunger of something not her own. "We've been waiting," came another whisper, this time from behind the black door, soft, coaxing, the way the masters used to speak when promising freedom they would never grant. "Come closer. Let us see your face." Her chest tightened. The corridor tilted, shadows running like liquid down the walls, pooling at her feet, wrapping around her toes, creeping upward as though to bind her. She pulled back, gasped sharp and low, her breath cutting through the whispers like a knife. She turned, ready to flee back the way she came, and stopped. For the corridor behind her was no longer empty. They stood there, silent, a line of figures stretching into the dark. The masters of the house, their eyes wide, glassy, their lips blackened and cracked from poison, their skin wet with sweat that no longer cooled, their necks bent as though strings still pulled them down into their plates, but their feet carried them forward, step by shuddering step. The children were among them, faces pale and mouths slack, clutching their dolls and wooden toys like funeral relics, their eyes reflecting no innocence, only the same blackness that lived in the walls. The corridor pulsed, the house groaned, and she knew the black door was no choice, no temptation. It was the only way, the only path left. Her hand closed around the handle, the metal searing her flesh, a hiss rising from her palm as skin burned against it. She bit back a cry, teeth digging into her tongue until the taste of iron filled her mouth. The door swung open, not with a creak but with a sigh, long and satisfied, as though it had been waiting centuries for this moment. And beyond it, not darkness, not light, but something deeper, a corridor that bent away from sight, its walls breathing, its floor slick as though alive. Voices rising within it, layered and endless, chanting her name like a psalm carved from hunger. The poisoned dead behind her shuffled closer, their silence more suffocating than screams, their eyes fixed on her with devotion not to her, but to what awaited through the door. She stepped across the threshold, and the black door closed behind her, swallowing the corridor whole. The night did not part for her. It closed around her like a throat swallowing, heavy and endless, as if the world itself had grown tired of sound. She moved barefoot through the wet earth, every step sinking into the soil that had once cut her heels raw, every step pressing against the roots of cane that had drunk centuries of sweat and blood. The field stretched before her like a sea gone black, stalks rising tall and still, not swaying, not whispering, not moving at all. It was the silence that unnerved her most, silence so thick it pressed against her ears, until she could hear the thunder of her own pulse. Even the night insects, the owls, the restless sigh of the swamp gone. The world had folded into a single breathless pause. Behind her, the mansion sat like a carcass, its silhouette sagging against the horizon. The windows glowed faintly, not with firelight but with the sickly shimmer of decay, as though the house itself burned from within its bones. The ruin was not destruction, it was judgment. She did not turn back, for she knew the walls still watched. The air above the field seemed weighted, dragging down on her shoulders. She thought she heard the faint jangle of chains carried on a wind that did not blow. Her body stiffened. She knew these fields. She knew them better than her own skin. Here was where she had bent until her spine felt carved from iron. Here was where laughter had been beaten from throats. Here was where names had been buried in the soil and never returned, and now the earth seemed to breathe. She knelt, pressing her palm to the ground, and the soil was warm. Not the warmth of life, but the warmth of something that had never cooled. Beneath her fingertips she felt vibrations, like the faint rattle of bones clinking together. The cane fields shivered. One stalk bent, then another, as though bowing toward her. A low moan slid across the night, too deep to be wind, too human to be anything else. She stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. "Keep walking," she whispered to herself, though her voice felt stolen from her lips. The path between the rows stretched ahead, impossibly long, stretching further the more she looked at it. Darkness folded over the stalks like a curtain. Somewhere inside something moved, something that bent the silence with each step. A cane stalk cracked loudly, sharp as a gunshot. She froze, the sound vibrating in her skull. Then another snap, closer this time. The stalks parted as though cut by invisible hands. Shapes began to gather in the spaces between them. Not men, not beasts, but shadows hunched and crooked, wearing the outlines of bodies long buried, their heads tilted toward her, but their faces were hollow, carved away, as though silence itself had eaten their features. One stepped forward, dragging something behind it. Not a chain, not a rope, but a shadow thicker than night, leaving grooves in the dirt as it passed. Another figure rose from the soil itself, its body dripping earth, its ribs open like the bars of a broken cage. Its voice was not a voice at all, but the sound of a shovel striking wood again and again. She stumbled backward, clutching her chest. "Do you hear it?" whispered the stalks, rustling though the air was still. "Do you hear the field remembering?" The figures pressed closer, their silence louder than screams. Some crawled, some staggered, some simply loomed, bending over her with shadows for mouths. She knew them, not by name but by the weight they carried. The ones who had collapsed in these fields, never rising. The ones whose backs had broken. The ones whose names had never been spoken again. And the field remembered them all. Her knees trembled, her vision swam. She wanted to run, but the earth clung to her feet, heavy as shackles. "Walk!" a voice rasped from behind her. She turned, but there was nothing. Only the house far away, hunched like a dying beast. Still the voice pressed into her bones. "If you stop, you stay. If you stay, you sink." The shadow figures gathered on either side of her, forming a passage through the cane, their heads bent low as if in reverence or in warning. She dared not look too long at their hollow faces, for each time she did, she thought she recognized the eyes of someone she had once known, someone who should have been free, someone swallowed by the field. Her steps were slow, careful, heavy. With each one, the silence grew louder, as though the earth itself leaned closer, listening. The field pulsed beneath her, alive, as though it had grown a heart, and then she reached the center, here. The silence ended. It was broken not by wind, not by insect, not by bird, but by the sound of sobbing. Soft, distant, childlike. It rose from the earth, muffled and raw as though 100 children wept beneath the soil, their cries pressing against the roots, against her ears, against her mind. Her hands flew to her head, pressing hard, but the cries only grew. "We are still here," they whispered. "We are still beneath." She staggered forward, gasping for breath, when her foot struck something hard in the dirt. She looked down, saw wood beneath the soil, rotting boards broken open, a coffin lid split apart by roots. From the gap inside, a pale hand reached upward, fingers clutching blindly, nails torn and bleeding. The sobbing stopped. The hand twitched. Then another appeared, and another. All along the path, the earth cracked open, hands pushing through, clawing, reaching, desperate to rise. She broke into a run, the earth shaking beneath her, the field erupting with the sound of splintering wood and dragging chains. The cries rising now in a single chorus, not of mourning but of hunger. And yet the silence was not gone, it was inside the cries, the kind of silence that follows death, heavy and final, the silence that clings even when voices rise. She ran, her breath burning, the path ahead still endless, the shadows closing, the sobbing turning to laughter. Behind her, the mansion glowed faintly against the horizon. Before her, the cane field whispered her name in voices not her own. And when she looked down, she saw her own shadow dragging behind her, longer than her body, longer than the night, pulled by something beneath the soil that refused to let go. The night grew narrower as she entered the rows, the stalks closing in like ribs around a heart too large to contain itself. The cane stretched high above her head, blades sharp and slick with dew, yet they trembled without wind, their stalks creaking in unison, not with the voice of plants, but with the cadence of speech. A murmuring chorus pressed into the marrow of her bones. Each sound slid against the next like scales, rising, falling, repeating, as though the field itself had learned the rhythm of prophecy. She kept her head low, her breath shallow, her steps deliberate. But every footfall drew an answer, the rustle of stalks, the hiss of leaves brushing against one another. Voices forming words not meant for living ears. "You have fed us," the cane whispered, their stems bending toward her as though in prayer. "Or you have broken the feast." She froze, her eyes darting left, right into the blackness between the rows. No figure stood there, only the endless cane bowing and swaying. But the voices did not stop. "The bitter root," they hissed. The bitter root, the bitter root, the root of endings. Her hands trembled, but she pressed them into her skirts, forcing stillness, forcing silence. To speak would be to join them. To answer would be to bind herself to their tongue. The stalks bent lower, their tips grazing her shoulders, their blades caressing her neck like knives too patient to cut. The earth beneath her feet pulsed, one slow beat then another, until she realized the field itself had a heart, and the heart was listening. She stepped forward. The rows did not part but bent, rearranging themselves, guiding her deeper. No matter which direction she turned, the path closed behind her, the cane weaving together in silence, the voices swelling louder. "We remember chains," they whispered. "We remember blood. We remember the taste of prayers swallowed in dirt." A chill worked its way up her spine. She felt them press against her mind, pulling memory loose, dragging fragments of her own life into their whispers. She heard her name, spoken by voices she had long buried. Her mother's voice, ragged from crying, her father's voice broken from shouting, the voices of children who had vanished into the cane and never returned. "We drank them," the field murmured. "We drank them all." Her throat tightened. Her feet tangled in the roots. She stumbled, catching herself against the stalks. The leaves sliced her palms, leaving thin, wet lines of red. The cane trembled eagerly, its blades drinking the drops as though tasting. "Yours is sweeter," they hissed. "Yours is the blood that will end us or bind us." The air thickened, cloying, heavy with the stench of rot and sugar. She tried to move, but the cane bent tighter, the stalks crossing before her, behind her, forming a cage. Their voices grew sharper, no longer whispers but chants, no longer prayers but demands. "Choose, choose, choose," they sang. Bitter root or sweet cane, death or crown, silence or tongue. She clenched her teeth, fighting the urge to scream. Her body swayed with the rhythm of their chant, as though her bones no longer belonged to her. From the corner of her eye she saw them, faces etched into the stalks themselves, eyes pressed into the nodes, mouths carved along the fibers, their features shifting, changing, becoming those she once knew. One face bent low, its lips forming the name she had carried since birth, but twisted, cursed, unrecognizable. "Your gods are not ours," the face whispered, "but we will bow to you if you bow to us." The cane around her bowed deeply, hundreds of stalks bending in unison, their tips pressing into the dirt, their shadows stretching long and skeletal in the moonlight. It was not reverence, it was submission. They swayed, and in their swaying she heard it, the sound of chains dragging, the crack of whips, the groan of bodies bent against their will. The field was not a field. It was a grave that had learned to speak. Her breath shuddered. She pressed forward, though the rows thickened, though the whispers clawed at her mind. Every stalk that touched her left a welt. Every voice that spoke her name pulled her deeper into their hunger. And then the chanting stopped. The silence struck like a bell. The field bowed lower still. Every stalk bent until its leaves brushed the ground. The earth before her trembled, splitting wide. From the fissure rose a stalk taller than the rest, its body black, its leaves sharp as blades, its head heavy with fruits swollen and dripping with dark liquid. The other stalks bent toward it, murmuring words too low to catch, their whispers trembling with awe and dread. She stared at it, her breath sharp in her chest. The fruit split open with a wet tear. From its flesh spilled not juice but teeth, small and human, clattering to the ground like hail. The voices rose again, layered and endless. "Eat and you are ours. Refuse and you are lost." The cane bent closer, closer, until their blades pressed against her skin, drawing thin lines of blood. The voices thickened in her head, filling every corner, every space, until she could no longer hear her own thoughts. Her knees trembled. Her breath broke. She felt her hands reaching, though she willed them still. Her fingers brushed the dripping fruit, and the teeth inside began to bite. The water accepted her without question, black as ink, wide as eternity. Something stirred beneath, ancient and waiting. But it did not harm her. It only carried her deeper. The bayou at night was no place for the living, and yet she waded into it as though born of its rot. The cypress trees loomed like sentinels, their roots clawing at the dark water like skeletal hands. The air smelled of damp moss and old secrets. Every ripple seemed a whisper, every frog's croak a curse spoken in another tongue. The mansion was far behind her now, though its ruins still clung to her skin like smoke. Each step into the bayou was a step away from chains, away from lashes, away from the cries of men collapsing at her poisoned table. But freedom was never a straight path. It wound itself through shadows, through dread, through places where the earth bled into water and the water into dream. She whispered prayers to spirits that had no names in the tongue of her masters, words older than iron, older than Louisiana itself. Her breath trembled as she spoke, yet the cane-field wind seemed to carry her voice deeper into the swamp. As if the bayou itself were listening, child of ash, the water seemed to murmur. Child of venom, child of ruin, she froze. The cattails brushed her arms, and the water lapped against her waist. She thought it was her own mind speaking. Yet when she looked down, the reflection staring back at her was not her own. Its eyes were wider, darker. Its mouth moved, though she made no sound. It was the face of survival, yes, but also of something altered, something claimed behind her. A heron shrieked and took flight, wings slicing the air like blades. She did not turn, for she knew what she would see, the faint orange glow of the plantation burning, its light dancing on the water like a ghost lantern. The deeper she went, the more the swamp shifted. The trees no longer looked like trees, but like twisted forms of men bowed in torment, their bark glistening like flesh in moonlight, their branches sagging like broken arms. She passed them one by one, and each seemed to lean lower, closer, as though in recognition. At times the water grew shallow and warm, thick with reeds that whispered like gossiping slaves. Then suddenly it plunged cold and endless. Swallowing her up to the chest, something brushed her thigh, a fish, or perhaps a hand. She did not flinch, for the bayou was no stranger than the life she had fled. She remembered a tale whispered by the old women in the quarters, of spirits who lingered in the swamp. Not saints, not angels, but those who had drowned before their chains could be broken. They said the bayou was their grave and their sanctuary, their hunger and their mercy, and if one entered with the right blood on her hands, she might not drown, she might be carried to a place unseen. The air grew still. Her breath fogged though the night was warm. She pressed her palm to her chest, feeling the steady hammer of her heart. Then silence, not even the frogs, not even the crickets, only the drip of water from the moss, and beneath it a sound slow and vast, like something enormous stirring beneath the black surface. "Take me," she whispered. "Carry me where chains cannot." The water rose higher. Though the ground beneath her had not changed, it cradled her, lifted her, and she drifted as though asleep, her eyes closed. Her hair spread upon the water like ink. She should have sunk, yet she floated, the swamp itself bearing her weight. When she opened her eyes, the moon was gone, replaced by a heavy sky veined with dark clouds. The trees leaned closer now, their branches forming arches, doorways, tunnels. Guiding her deeper and deeper still, she saw lights flickering between the trunks. Not lanterns, but pale green flames that licked the air without smoke. Dancing like will-o-wisps, the reflection of one flame slid across her skin, and in that glow, she saw shapes moving just beneath the surface. Not fish, not snakes, but the outlines of bodies, dozens, hundreds, floating just beneath the water as though waiting for breath. Their eyes opened as she passed, yet none rose, they simply drifted, their gaze heavy upon her, their mouths parting as though to murmur prayers she could not hear. The current shifted, slow but sure, pulling her toward those lights. Her body turned with it, her hands outstretched as if reaching for something unseen, and when she blinked, she swore she saw a figure on the bank ahead, tall, shrouded, holding a staff carved of bone, its face hidden in the shadows of its hood. Yet its presence felt older than the bayou itself. Her lips parted, but no sound left her. The figure lifted its staff, and the water beneath her surged. Cold hands brushed her ankles, her waist, her throat, guiding her, carrying her, not to drown her, but to deliver her as though she had been chosen, as though her venom had written her name in their dark scripture. The bayou whispered with voices now, hundreds layered over hundreds, chanting her steps forward, praising her poison, her escape, her defiance, her sin, and her salvation. And yet, just as the figure began to step closer, the water beneath her split open, as if the swamp itself had torn its mouth wide, and the last thing she felt was a rush of air colder than death pulling her downward. She tried to scream, but the bayou swallowed the sound whole, and the last thing she saw was the figure lowering its hood, revealing not a face but a skull grinning in eternal welcome. The horizon bled faint light, pale and uncertain, but those who later searched swore the sun rose over fields that reeked of death, while her footprints ended where no road began. Dawn did not come kindly that morning. It crawled like a wounded thing, dragging its light over the ruined land. The cane fields lay still as corpses, their stalks broken and bent as though some giant hand had crushed them in the night. The air hung heavy, rank with the stench of iron and decay, a perfume of endings. The mansion was little more than a husk, its windows shattered, its roof sagging under the smoke that curled upward like the last breath of a dying beast. Those who wandered there afterward said the birds would not perch on its blackened beams, that the dogs howled and tore at their chains whenever they drew near, and that even the flies refused the feast of swollen flesh scattered through the halls. Yet it was not the ruin of the house that clung to memory, nor the silence of fields where laughter and lashes had once echoed. It was the trail she left behind, bare footprints pressed into the mud, delicate and deliberate, as though she were walking not away from death but towards something that had summoned her. Each print darkened the earth beneath it, as though her very steps carried the stain of poison into the soil. "They don't end," whispered a boy who had followed the tracks. "They don't end anywhere." His mother struck him silent. Yet his words spread like seed in wind, for it was true. The footprints ran across the yard, past the gates into the wild grass, then vanished where no road or river or path lay waiting. It was as if the earth had opened and swallowed her whole. The horizon bled wider, streaking the sky with veins of red, yet no warmth came with it. The sun seemed reluctant, burdened, half-risen, its pale face bruised by shadow, and in that light, the fields looked less like fields than graves unmarked. Each row of cane a marker, each hollow a mouth waiting to speak. The searchers muttered among themselves, their voices breaking against the stillness. One swore he heard humming, soft and low, like a woman crooning a hymn over a child. Another claimed he saw her figure between the trees, stooping, then rising, always a step ahead, always dissolving before his eyes. "She walks still," he said, "but not here. Not in the world we know. Some swore the bayou had claimed her, its waters rising to drink her shadow. Others whispered she had passed into the realm of the drowned, carried by hands of those who had died in chains, their spirits lifting her into their hidden kingdom. There were those who spat and cursed her name, saying the devil himself had taken her as bride, and that her poison was but a dowry paid in blood. Yet when the sun finally broke the horizon, or seemed to, it revealed something no one could explain. In the center of the field, where her footprints had last been seen, lay a circle of blackened earth, as though fire had burned there in perfect shape. Yet no ash remained, no smoke, no coal, only soil dark as pitch pulsing faintly, like the skin of something alive beneath the ground. A man knelt near it, against his better judgment, and placed his hand on the soil. He cried out and stumbled back, his palm blistered as though pressed to iron heated in the forge. "It beats," he gasped. "It beats like a heart." The others fled. "For what heart lies buried in the earth? What heart lives after death still?" the boy returned, though his mother warned him not to. Drawn as if by thread, he came at dusk, when the circle glowed faintly, and laid his ear to the ground. What he heard was not silence but a chorus, hundreds of voices rising and falling, a litany of chains clattering, of prayers whispered, of laughter freed from throats that no longer bled, and beneath it all the steady rhythm of footsteps marching deeper, deeper, away from all roads into some country unseen. "She keeps walking," he whispered, his eyes wide with terror and awe. "She keeps walking." Even now, when the villagers gathered again, the circle had spread, wider, darker, seeping like spilled ink across the field. The cane refused to grow near it. Animals would not graze, and by the second dawn, the air itself carried a weight that bent the shoulders and dimmed the breath, as though the earth were remembering pain too great to be contained. Those who came too close spoke of dreams that clung even after waking, dreams of following a woman barefoot through endless corridors of reed and bone, her hand beckoning, her shadow long as eternity, and always at the end, a door that opened not into a room but into a mouth yawning wide, lined with teeth of stone and water. Some awoke screaming, others did not awake at all, their faces twisted in something too sharp for fear and too deep for joy, as if they had seen the place she walked and chosen not to return. And so the story was spoken, hushed and hurried, passed like contraband through generations, the tale of the woman who poisoned her masters and vanished before dawn, whose steps beat still beneath the soil, carrying her farther than any road could lead. Yet the fields remember, the bayou remembers, and when the sun rises sickly pale and the cane rustles without wind, there are those who swear they see footprints pressed freshly into the earth, wet with dew dark as blood, leading once more toward the place where no road begins, and the circle widens still.